Now, this story took place about 3 years ago. There was in a Midwestern city in the United States, there was a family of four, mom and dad, and a 14-year-old boy named Tucker and his 12-year-old sister named Annie. And dad worked for a company and he got a vacation every year. He loved to take the family to different places on vacation. And one year he took them down to Arizona to dig for dinosaur fossils. One year he took them up to Churchill, Alaska in the fall, where the polar bears come through Churchill, and you go out in a big tracked vehicle and look at the polar bears. About 3 years ago, around this time of year, around March, he came home one night and said to the family, listen, we've never been to the ocean. How about a trip when school gets out to the Bahama Islands and we can learn to dive and snorkel and look at ships that have been sunk and so forth in the Bahama Islands. And the kids had never been to the ocean, and they knew how to swim because of swimming lessons in the summer and pools in the city and stuff like that. But they'd never been to the ocean. They said, yeah, let's do that. That sounds fantastic. So when school got out, and it was around June, the family took off and flew to Miami, and then flew across from Miami about 90 miles to the Bahama Islands. Now, the Bahama Islands is a big, huge, long chain of hundreds and hundreds of islands, about 100 miles, 90 miles off of the eastern coast of Florida. They have a lot of history. One of the things about the Bahama Islands was that it became a hiding place for pirates. Pirates robbing the treasure ships headed to England, France, Germany, Italy, Spain became a real problem for those countries. And in time, the countries sent their big warships out to patrol the waters of the Atlantic between Central and South America and Europe. And the warships had, 3 layers or banks of cannons on each side of the ship. And the pirates used much smaller ships with maybe one bank of cannons. Now the pirates could, take merchant ships down pretty easily, but they were no match for these warships. And so what happened was that after the countries started sending their warships, the pirates used the Bahama Islands as a hiding place because there they could get into the shallower waters among these islands out of sight of the big warships, and the warships had too much draft. That is, their hulls went too deep into the water to allow them to get in among those islands. And so pirates used the Bahamas for hideouts a lot during the days of the treasure ships. Anyway, the family flew to the Bahama Islands on a regular plane, then got in a little small plane and flew down the chain of islands and landed. And then they got on a boat with an outboard and went about 2 hours among the islands out to the eastern edge of the islands, close to the ocean, to an island that just had one hotel on it, one hotel with 30 rooms. That's all that was there. And it was really cool because in the hotel, the dining room of the hotel had a ceiling, but on three sides was completely open. No walls, no windows, no nothing. It was completely open to gardens outside of the dining room. So you would be sitting there eating breakfast, having, French toast and bacon and orange juice, and here would come a hummingbird flying through the dining room, or a butterfly, or other kinds of birds and butterflies. And it was a really, really cool experience. And Tucker and Annie really liked it. Uh, Now, in the hotel was a big pool, and the guests were taught how to snorkel and how to dive. Now, the age limit for diving was more or less 15 or 16. And, Tucker was 14, Annie was 12. So they went to snorkeling lessons. Now, you probably know this, but snorkeling, you have a mouthpiece and you have a tube that goes up one side of your head above the water with a bend in the end of it. And there's a little mesh over the tube, the end of the tube, and in the tube is sort of something like a ping pong ball. And so you can breathe through the snorkel, but what you do is you float on your stomach looking down, and the snorkel is above your head in the air. And you can breathe through it, and you don't have to raise your head. You can keep your head down all the time. You can dive with the snorkel also. You kick your feet up in the air and you dive. And when you go underwater, the ball at the end of the tube blocks water from rushing down the tube into your mouth. Now you can go down for as long as you can hold your breath. So Tucker and Annie got pretty good at this pretty quick. Mom and Dad took diving lessons, and that's where you have a tank of oxygen on your back and weights to keep you down, and you can go way down deep now and look at wrecks and shipwrecks and stuff like that. Here's the difference. In snorkeling, you're really close to the surface, and the sun coming through the water shows all the brilliant colors of the fish swimming maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 feet down under the surface. When you're diving, you can go way down, 190, 80, 60 feet down, and dive on wrecks, old wrecks, some of them old wooden wrecks from old sailing ships. Occasionally, they do an old modern ship, freighter or something, they sink it. And I've gone down, and you can dive through the passageways and the rooms on a freighter, and it's pretty cool. But the light isn't as good, because the deeper you get, the dimmer the light. The sun can't reach down brightly. So the trade-off is you get to dive on the wrecks with diving gear, and with snorkeling gear you get to stay close to the surface and see all the fish. Every day, two outboard engine boats would go out with the hotel guests, one with divers and one with snorkelers. And they would go to different locations. Snorkelers would go to shallower water, the divers would go to deeper water. And picnic lunches would be taken on the boat. So they go out in the mid-morning and come back in the middle of the afternoon, something like that. Well, Tucker and Annie progressed really well with their snorkeling, and before long they were going on the snorkeling boat. Mom and Dad were going on the diving boat. Now, the snorkeling boat went to different locations, and one of the favorite locations that, as a matter of fact, the favorite location for Tucker and Annie was a small circular uninhabited island. And on one side of the island, the bottom of the ocean dropped away very, very gradually. There were rocks and bushes and underwater bushes and foliage with lots of colorful fish. On the other side of the island it was the open ocean, and on the other side of the island was a cliff that went down 200 feet down underwater. Now, along the side of the cliff were all kinds of plants growing, and it was very a lot of vegetation along the side of that cliff. And in that vegetation were wonderful, wonderful species of fish swimming around, eating, and you could go along, you know, on the surface or dive down a little bit and see wonderful, wonderful fish. So, about 10 days into the trip, the snorkeling boat went to Tucker and Annie's favorite island. And you dive by pairs, so you look out for one another. All the other guests went to the shallow side of the island to look for fish, to snorkel for fish. Tucker and Annie loved the cliff, so they went to the cliffside. Now, the guy driving the outboard from the hotel positioned the boat so he could see all the snorkelers in the shallower water, and he could also see the snorkels of Tucker and Annie in the deeper water, and he could keep an eye on them. So Tucker and Annie are swimming along the side of the cliff, and about 15 feet down, they see a beautiful, beautiful purple fish about that long with a band of yellow down its whole body. And Tucker looks over at, pokes Annie in the shoulder and points to his eyes and then points down at this fish, and she looks down and sees it and gives him a thumb up. And he pokes her again and he says, "You and me kick down to see the fish." And she says, "Okay." So they kick their legs up in the air, which causes the weight to drive them down, and they kick down about 15 feet and then level out along the side of the cliff, looking at this beautiful, beautiful fish. They can hold their breath by now almost 2 minutes. They've been practicing. You work on holding your breath. You can hold it longer and longer with practice. So they're swimming along, and Tucker is to the outside, toward the ocean side. And they're looking at the fish, and then he looks down. And way, way down in the dark depths of the ocean, he sees a shape coming up towards them. And he studies it for a second, and he realizes it's a great white shark climbing towards them. Now, what's important to understand is great whites do not attack humans for food. Great whites eat seals and sea lions for food, but they're down low. And when they look up at the surface of the ocean, a human looks very much like a seal or a sea lion. And so this great white wasn't in attack mode, it was in sort of investigating mode to see what that was. And usually, you can go to shark books, you can see this. Usually, if a great white attacks a swimmer, it spits them out as soon as it tastes that it's not a sea lion or a seal. But often, the damage is enough that it kills a person. Not always, but often. And you can go to shark books and see people with scars all across their body where the mouth of a great white has bitten them and then spit them out, and they survived. They got to a doctor fast enough to survive. So this great white is coming uh, slowly but quite steadily up, and Tucker realizes they don't have much time, so he looks frantically, and they don't have enough time to get to the surface. He looks frantically along the wall of the cliff, and he sees a cave opening in the side of the cliff. And he pokes Annie in the shoulder and points down, and she looks down and her eyes get really big because she knows what that is. And then he pokes her again and pokes over at the cave and pushes her toward the cave. And she starts flippering as fast as she can towards the cave, and he's right behind her, pushing on her flippers when he can. And they get to the cave, and it's big enough for them to go in, but not big enough for the great white to get in. So they go in into the entrance of the cave, and the great white cruises by just as they get there. And Tucker looks back, and he sees that the cave goes on into the cliff. So he pokes Annie and starts leading the way, and he leads the way back through turns and twists in the cave, and their lungs are, you know, they're really running out of breath. And just as they've got to have air, the cave gets a light above them, and they break their heads out of the water, and they're in an underwater cave. In other words, there's air above them, and the coral is glowing over the roof of the cave. It's high enough that they can get, they get a good breath of air, and it's high enough that they can see, and there's light in there, and there's a little sandy beach. The water goes up to a little sandy beach, and behind the beach is a cave roof and sand on the floor, and a cave roof going back, and then tapering down. The roof tapers down to kind of dark rocks at the back of the cave. So they swim over to the sand, pull off their masks and snorkels and flippers, and Tucker says, maybe there's a way out of this cave onto the island. And let's go look. And so they get up, and they can stand. The cave is tall enough at that point for them to stand up. As it gets closer to the back of the cave, they're going to have to bend down and crawl and look. And they take about 10 steps toward the back of the cave, and Annie jumps back and says, "What is that?" And she points at the sand. And there, lying on the sand, is a human skeleton with little bits of cloth sticking out of the bones. And the head is bent way back, and the mouth wide open. It's the skull, the mouth wide open in this wide open kind of expression. And right off the left hand of the skeleton is a sword, a very old, rusty sword. The blade of it, the sword has a handle, and then the blade goes up and bends at the end. And there's nothing left. It's pitted, which means the rust is eaten into the steel. And Tucker picks it up and looks at it, and he says, "Look at this. This is a cool sword." And he takes his thumb and checks the edge of the sword blade, and he says, "Whoa, that is still sharp. Even though it's rusted and pitted, that is still sharp." So he puts it down, and he says, "Oh, who do you think that is?" Tucker said, "I don't know, but look at that." And they look a little further back in the cave, and there in the sand are three wooden boxes, not very big, not very tall, maybe a foot tall and maybe a foot across. Wooden boxes with a wooden top. Just plain wooden boxes. Three of them. So Annie says, "Let's check this out." So she goes over, kneels down, and lifts the lid of the box. And inside, it is filled with treasure. It has diamonds and emeralds. It has gold bracelets, gold necklaces, gold headbands. It's filled with items of gold and jewels. And Tucker says, "Let's check out the next one." And he kneels down and lifts the lid of the next one. The same thing. Gold. Little bars of gold, a little bit bigger bars of gold, bracelets, diamonds, treasure. And he says, "Let's check out the next one." And she kneels down and lifts the lid, and she's got the lid halfway up when there's a sound from the back of the cave. Now, I can't duplicate that sound. It's very, very hard to duplicate the sound. The best thing I always try to describe the sound is it's like rubbing your hands really fast together to make a kind of a rubbing sound, but the sound wasn't fast. The sound was just a rubbing. Okay? And they look at the back of the cave where the sound's coming from. And out of the darkness appears a head. And it's about this long. And it is pointing at them. And it's about this wide with two eyes on either side. And it's low, low to the sand. It's maybe a few inches off the sand. It's looking right at them. And it's coming out of the shadows. And they stand there and look at it. And then the head moves to their left along the side where the cave touches the sand. And, on the screen, on my screen, it would be this way, it'd be over here. And it's moving very slowly. It stays about the same height above the sand, and it's moving very slowly along the base of the cave wall. And behind it comes a circular body that gets wider and wider and wider. And they turn to face it, keeping their eyes on it, looking at it. And it moves along the base of the wall until it's across from them. And Annie says, "What is that?" And Tucker says, "That's a snake." And he says, "I know, but what kind of a snake is that?" And it kept coming and coming and coming, moving to their left along the base of the cave, with the head always facing them. And Tucker says, I think that's an anaconda. And they are slowly pivoting, turning, keeping themselves always looking at the head of the snake. And it's gradually progressing towards the water along the base of the cave. Now, anacondas, as you probably know, kill you by constriction. They get a wrap around you and they crush you to death, and then they eat you whole. They are biting snakes, but um, they're not snakes that are poisonous. They can bite the heck out of you, but they're not poisonous. So uh, Tucker and Annie are pivoting, and the snake hasn't gotten any closer, and it's still coming. You know, they get to be 30 or more feet long. I mean, a big anaconda can be an absolutely enormous snake, and the snake's head gets to the edge of the water, and then it starts moving its body along the sand at the edge of the water so that they are now turned around away from the back of the cave facing the water, uh, behind, what was behind them and now in front of them. And all of a sudden, wham! Tucker feels something around his leg and he's yanked down flat on the sand. And he looks and he starts to be dragged across the sand, and he looks down at his ankle, and the tail of the snake has wrapped itself around his ankle and is dragging him across the sand. He's got his hands in the sand trying to stop himself, and he's being dragged across the sand. And Annie screams and grabs him and tries to hold him, but the snake's too strong. It's dragging him to where it can get a wrap around his body and crush him to death. And Tucker says, the sword, get the sword. And Annie runs over, grabs the sword, and raises it with two hands over her head, all the way up in the air, and gives a scream and brings the sword down as hard as she can on the tail. It goes about halfway through the tail, but it doesn't cut it. And he says, again, as he's being dragged closer and closer. And Annie raises the sword and screams and swings the sword as hard as she can, and it severs the tail. And she grabs Tucker and pulls him back away from the snake's body, and the tail, the cut tail, it's cut about maybe 2 feet from the tip of the tail flips back against the wall, flips, throwing blood, snake's blood all over the wall, and they back away from anywhere close to the body. Now the snake has now progressed behind them along the edge of the water and is almost at the far side of the cave. But it's keeping its body is still at the edge of the water, and it's really big. The body's really big where it is along the water. And Annie says, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Tucker says, give me the sword. I've got an idea. So he takes a sword and he says, now, I'm going to distract the snake with a sword. When I give you the word, I want you to jump over its body, grab your mask and flippers and your snorkel, get into the water and go to the front of the cave. Go out the tunnel. And she says, I'm not leaving without you. And he says, all right, do what I say, jump the body of the snake when I give you the word, get your mask and snorkel and your flippers on and wait, and I'll join you. So the snake has now come around and is it's not in a circle around them, but it's in a half circle around them. And Tucker gets the sword and he holds it out and leans forward as far as he can lean and starts twitching it at the snake's head. Pretty close, 8 or 9 inches away from the snake's head, twitching it back and forth, back and forth. And the snake hisses and it draws back its head. And that's what Tucker's waiting for. And he keeps teasing it, and the snake pulls its head back and strikes. And when it strikes, he swings the sword at it, but he doesn't hit it with the edge of the sword. He hits it with the flat part of the sword and hits it on the side of the head. And the snake pulls back, and Tucker says, "Go!" to Annie. And she leaps over the snake's body, grabs her mask, snorkel, and the snorkel's attached to the mask, puts it on, gets her flippers on, and jumps into the water. And the snake's head comes forward again. And Tucker has the sword. He does the same thing. He teases the snake back and forth, as far as he can reach out his hand. He's scared because the snake can strike a pretty good distance. So he's got the length of the sword and the length of his arm. He doesn't want a snake to get him in the arm. So he's teasing it. It hisses, draws back its head, and strikes. And he swings at it again, misses, in the sense that he just hits it on the side of the head, drops the sword, leaps over the thick part of the snake's body, which it can't, the thick part of its body, really thick, it can't react that quickly. Jumps over it, grabs his mask, snorkel, flippers, jumps into the water, gets his mask on, puts his flippers on, and says, "Go!" And Annie starts underwater back down the tunnel to the ocean, and he follows her. She swims through the twists and turns of the tunnel and gets to the out opening of the cave and stops. And there is the body of the great white going past. And sharks, when they're looking for prey or investigating things, they circle. They circle and circle. And the great white is circling outside the entrance to the cave, waiting to see what might come out of it. So the body of the great white is going past, from their left to their right, going past the opening of the cave. And it's really close. I mean, it's 3 feet away from the opening of the cave, but it's a huge shark. And Tucker waits until the head is turned completely away from them as the shark continues its circle. And when the head is completely away so it can't see them, he grabs Annie, pushes her out, and shoves her up. And it's only 15 feet to the surface, and the beach is right behind him. And she goes like a shot up through the water and comes halfway out of the water, flops over onto the sand, and drags herself away from the water. And he's right behind her. And he shoots he's kicking so hard he shoots halfway out of the water, and all of a sudden, wham! He feels something hit him on the ankle, and before he can even take a breath, he's dragged down under the water. And he looks down, and the anaconda has followed them out of the cave and has grabbed him by the ankle and is pulling him down. He kicks as hard as he can. He can't. The anaconda, blood's coming out of his leg where the anaconda has bitten him. It's dragging him back down. He's struggling. He didn't have time to take a breath. He's running out of air. He's starting to black out when all of a sudden the pressure is released and he's free. And he kicks like crazy with his good leg and even with his bad leg. And he gets to the surface and just has time for a huge gasp of air when Annie wades out, grabs him by the shoulder, and pulls him onto the beach and drags him out of the water. Blood's come out of his leg like crazy. And she says, "Are you your leg? Are you all right?" And he says, "Yeah," but he said the snake got me by the leg. And she drags him a little further away from the water, and then there's a splash. And they look, and out of the water, into the air, comes the great white in a huge leap out of the water, clears the water, goes across, and dives back down into the water. And trailing out of either side of its mouth is the anaconda. And the great white splashes into the water and disappears. And the water is calm. Annie gets up and runs to the edge of the island where she can see the boat. She screams at the guy in the boat about the shark, 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 and he comes and gets them, gets all the other snorkelers out of the water, and heads for the hotel. They wrap Tucker's ankle in towels, and they get to the hotel, and it takes 30 stitches on his ankle and his calf to sew him up. And they bandage him and sew him up. And 2 days later, they go back to the island with the hotel manager and mom and dad and Tucker and Annie. And the hotel manager says, "You know, this island has always been deserted. People have tried to live on it, and you can see some broken down ruins, but they've always disappeared. And everyone in the area thought the island was haunted. But I think we have a different answer. I think the anaconda got them." So they get on the island and they search around. They do find a way into the cave and they recover the treasure. Now the treasure belongs to the Bahama Islands. It doesn't belong to the family. The treasure belongs to the Bahama Islands. If it were out in the ocean, that'd be a different matter. But the treasure belongs to the Bahama Islands. But it's extremely valuable. And they pay the Bahama government pays all the expenses for the family, for the hotel, for everything, gets free tickets home, and gives them $100,000 as a reward for this treasure. So because of Tucker's injury, the family can't stay, so they head home. And in a few hours, after going through Miami, they're landing at their home airport. And they get their baggage and get their car, and they're driving home. Tucker and Annie are in the back seat. And Dad looks in the back seat through the rearview mirror at them, and he says, "Well," he says, "kids, would you ever consider going back to the ocean after this experience?" And Tucker looks at Annie, and Annie looks at Tucker, and they say, "You bet." And that is the end of the story. Now, let's think about something, a different end for you guys to create. So here is, I'll give you the problem. Here's the problem. the great white does not get the anaconda. The anaconda keeps dragging Tucker further underwater. Now you write the new ending to that story. Okay? Have fun with it. Cheers.